So this is a Zoom call into the report from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, which reported today on the Catholic Church. And we're delighted that John O'Brien, the Secretary to the Inquiry, is joining us on the call. And John, I know you can't stay for the whole hour, so we're going to ask you to come first into the conversation, but we will be widening it out later. We do have journalists on the call who will be asking you questions. And then we do have Brenden Thompson, the CEO at Catholic Voices, who gives this description that you give an authoritative but unofficial Catholic view of events. And Professor Tina Beattie from the University of Roehampton, with various roles there, Director of the Digby Stuart Research Centre for Catholic Studies and of the Catherine of Siena College. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. And there are other people on the call who I know will wish to speak. So John, if I could start with you. The inquiry has been much reported already. It came out at 12 noon today. I wonder if I could ask you to give a brief overview of it, the various things that stood out for me, certainly. Firstly, that you say in your report that the Church's reputation was valued above the welfare of victims. And you charted various delays, the way it dealt with allegations and protected perpetrators. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, to expand on that and tell us why you reached that conclusion, please.
Of course. Hello. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for asking me to join today. So it's probably the best way to do that is just to go over a couple of quick examples and talk about it a bit more. So if we look back to the Church's to the inquiry's investigation into the Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Birmingham, there we found a couple of really quite specific instances which are outlined in that report where abuse of victims happening multiple times was reported to the church authorities. The priest concerned was moved from parish to parish. No apparent action was taken against him. No official investigation by the church was opened into the abuse, and the abuse wasn't reported to any of the statutory authorities. So there was a real example of where the abuser was allowed to continue to operate, albeit in a different parish. The allegations made of abuse were not investigated in any formal way by the church, and neither were those allegations passed to any outside authority to investigate. And the panel concluded on the evidence that was presented that was because they wanted to protect the reputation of the church. And so that was people might say the 1970s was a long time ago, but it's certainly the fairly recent past. If we look at the inquiry itself and this particular hearing that we're talking about right now, that this report is really about. So this was in 2018, 2019, and one of the things the panel particularly wanted to do was to hear evidence from the nuncio, the representative of the Holy See in the England and Wales, about particular evidence about Ealing Abbey, which we'd also looked at earlier and had written a report on, but they wanted particular evidence from the nuncio on that they thought he might be able to help with. There were several months worth of toing and froing negotiations about the statement, but in the end the nuncio decided not to provide one, which really disappointed the panel. Here we are in 2019, after the current Pope had said, we've got to get on top of this, we've really got to tackle it, had asked for a statement that would have helped the panel reach conclusions in the Ealing Abbey case and maybe recommendations about how the church might be able to move forward with protections for children within the Catholic estate, but refused to provide that evidence, which was clearly disappointing and clearly meant that the panel weren't able to see all of the evidence that they would have been able to use in Ealing Abbey had the statement been forthcoming from the nuncio. So I think that, together with the findings that we've already published from Downside and Ampleforth, from Ealing Abbey and from the Archdiocese of Birmingham, if you look at all of those examples there and the examples that they found in this particular hearing, that all of those have real examples with evidence that the church moved perpetrators around, failed to take the allegations of abuse from people who were abused within the church seriously, failed to investigate them, failed to involve outside authorities at the right opportunity, and then when given an opportunity to explain some of that to the inquiry and evidence, refused to do so. So that led the panel inevitably to the conclusion that the reputation of the church was on occasions put above the the protection of children within the church.
And you go on to write about Cardinal Vincent Nichols and his role of leadership in the church during this time, and that's already been seized on in the early press reports as the key finding, that it was a damning criticism of his leadership. You say that he apologised for the church's failings when he appeared at the public hearing, but there was no acknowledgement of any personal responsibility to lead or influence. Can you just describe the views of the panel when they heard this and were writing their report?
Yeah, so look, in any organisation, child sexual abuse requires two things, doesn't it? It requires the right procedures and practices and the people with the right expertise to help that organisation prevent it. But it also needs the right culture to really say throughout the organisation that child sexual abuse is not acceptable in our organisation. And the culture is inevitably tied up with leadership. And so if you have very senior leaders in any organisation, in this case the Catholic Church, not taking responsibility, not recognising the role they have as senior leaders to play in changing that culture and taking responsibility for the mistakes of the past and setting out for the future how they as a leader are going to make sure that doesn't happen again, then that makes it very difficult to see how the culture of an organisation is going to change. But the panel in this case also went slightly further, because they also said they didn't feel that Cardinal Vincent had shown empathy with the victims of abuse. And, I think that very much comes from their investigation into the Archdiocese of Birmingham and the issues there that I've talked about earlier in my update to you. So I think that, if you're going to change this in any organisation, you need those two things. You need a culture that says right from the top, this is not acceptable in this organisation. And then you need the right processes and procedures, as boring as that might seem, with backed up the right expertise to make sure you can live up to those words. And as I say, in this case, the panel found failings in those areas in both those categories, if I can put it like that. But in the case of Cardinal Vincent, it's fair to say that there was an acknowledgement of the wrongs of the past. There was an apology for them, but nothing forthcoming about what he, as the senior leader of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, was going to do about it.
Thank you. Thanks for introducing that. I wonder if we can go to Catherine Pepinster now, who's written extensively on stories about the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly has followed this the sex abuse inquiry. Catherine, if you're there, I'd like to unmute yourself and bring you into the conversation.
Yes, hello Ruth. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien, for what you've just been saying, which is familiar from the report. One of the things I wondered was that there's constantly a suggestion with the Catholic Church that the problem is clericalism. The problem is the way in which the officials of the church, are right at the top and they run it completely. There were quite a lot of lay people who were in safeguarding roles in the diocese that you looked at, of Westminster and Birmingham. I didn't get the impression that some of them had greater empathy for some of the victims of abuse, that there seemed to be a problem there too. And to what extent was that caused by clericalism as well, that their focus was on their priestly and episcopal bosses rather than any victims?
I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier, in that organisations tend to take their leadership issues from the top. And so I think because we weren't seeing that sort of leadership from the Cardinal, that perhaps was reflected further down the organisation. But perhaps it was better exemplified in what we said about Ampleforth and Downside, but Ampleforth in particular, where even where concerns were raised by the educational staff in Ampleforth, the decision, all of the authority rested with the abbot, and it was the abbot that had the authority to take the actions that would have stopped that abuse and didn't do so. So even where lay people, if you like, have raised concerns, they've hit a culture where they're not really listened to and where they don't see the action taken. And we shouldn't underestimate the dampening effect that can have on people doing that in the future. When they see that it's been reported that no action's being taken, people inevitably start to worry about whether that's the right thing to do and what impact it might have on their own roles and careers within the church in this case. And so it's really important that that cultural leadership from the senior people on the clerical side comes through, because very often they are the people with the ultimate authority to make the decisions about what needs to be done about it.
You've also been looking at the Church of England and other institutions. Was there a particular problem with the Catholic Church, or are there common denominators you see coming up time and time again in these different institutions?
There are definitely common denominators. I mean, the lack of leadership is not something that's exclusive to the Catholic Church. I mean, we clearly found evidence of it in the way that we have in other institutions, but, you know, we issued our Anglican report just a few weeks ago, and we were saying very many of the things that we're saying about this were said in that case too. So these are not issues that are solely related to the Catholic Church. You know, there are slight differences with the Catholic Church in that we, you know, with the evidence from the nuncio, we weren't able to insist on that evidence, but by no means are the leadership issues I'm talking about unique to the Catholic Church. But you know, in a way, that's what makes this this inquiry effective, if you like. We can join together those common failings that we find across different sectors to say these are the things that time and time again we are finding both prevent the proper support for victims once they've reported their abuse, but also prevent the right actions being taken quickly enough to prevent future abuse. And that is certainly something that we found common across many institutions, religious and otherwise. And
were there any other aspects within the Catholic Church that were not seen elsewhere but were problematic?
So I think the issues at Ampleforth and Downside, because of the particular role the abbots played there, was perhaps something we didn't see replicated quite like that in the other religions we looked at. But look, they are just extreme examples of what concentration on the sort of spiritual leadership rather than the educational leadership in that case brought to light. But they perhaps were slightly different because of the amount of authority that was vested in the abbot, and by that I mean not just the amount of authority he personally held, but the way that authority, that the people above him had limited authority to deal with that, if I can put it like that. His authority was in many ways, you know, the ultimate authority in that particular institution. So we perhaps saw that, but I wouldn't want to overemphasize that. The question you really asked me is, did we find the same sorts of failures of leadership in other organisations? And the simple answer is we did.
To what extent do you think that Christian ideas about the sinner needing mercy, the sinner needing help to redeem themselves, the whole idea of redemption in Christian churches, has that in some ways proved a problem here? You know, that in these churches, people will say to their bishop or whatever, I'm sorry, I've sinned, I won't do it again. And there was a kind of charitable belief that they won't, and that leads to lack of focus on the victim and more of a focus on the perpetrator. Do you think there's anything in that?
One of the central points in a way. So it's about balance, isn't it? Of course, as an organisation, all religious organisations provide that sort of spiritual guidance, if I can put it like that allows people that have perpetrated crimes or other issues to admit that to the church and to move forward and be forgiven in the religious sense. But that needs to be balanced, doesn't it, with what is the harm that has befallen to the person that has suffered whatever it is, in this case child sexual abuse, and what structures and what support is the church in this case putting in place around that. And I think you can see from this report that what the panel felt, there was a real imbalance in those things, certainly in the past and even up to the current day. There's a real imbalance and almost a collective consciousness to move towards forgiving the perpetrator without really understanding what the impact of forgiving the perpetrator is on the victim and what that means in terms of making sure the victim's needs and support are put in place as well. And I think that is a particular issue with religious organisations where, because of their very purpose, it hits victims harder that the very institution they expected to receive that from, they in many cases don't. And I think many victims told us that because it was in a religious organisation, it hit them much harder. It's the one place where they thought they'd get that support that they, you know, that the shock of not getting it hit really very much harder than perhaps it did in some other institutions where people told us that they hadn't been properly supported.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I know you can't stay with us for the whole hour, but can I just bring in a couple more journalists before you have to go? Could I go to Andrew Brown next with your question, please?
Yes, this is a question partly for John and partly for other people with experience. What explains the extraordinary sloth of the church to take action? I'm looking at page K3 of the report, and it's got various examples. In 2007, there was a review suggested that the Bishops' Conference should seek a general review on things within 12 months. It took 12 years to send a draft decree to the Holy See for approval. It took 13 years for the Bishops' Conference Code of Conduct to be approved since its recommendation. We have the extraordinary Safe Spaces project, which came up in the IICSA report on the Church of England too, proposed in 2015, anticipated to be launched 4 years later, finally launched in a botched and haphazard way at the beginning of October this year. What is it about the church that makes it so incredibly inefficient?
The simple answer from the inquiry's point of view of that is about this accountability. So one of the recommendations in this report is in each diocese, there's a person with clear responsibility for safeguarding issues. So I think the answer to that is you get so many different views at the different conferences and things that it takes so long to whittle them down to something that everybody can agree to, because nobody is responsible in many ways for leading that conversation and putting in the arguments, if I can put it like that, from the purely safeguarding perspective. And it gets mixed up in a way with the question that was asked earlier about the spiritual and the impact on the sort of spiritual role of the church. And I think that really, from the panel's point of view, would sum it up. If you have somebody with a clear responsibility to take that point of view, that you might perhaps arrive at some of these answers perhaps slightly sooner than you do when it falls into a pot where there's really a negotiation about that balance and what that action might look like.
I wonder, John, what recommendations you have for the church to change that then going forward?
So the one I've touched on there is they say that in each diocese there should somebody who clearly holds that role, regular training for members of the clergy on safeguarding matters, regular refresher training, the changing canon law that I think somebody's already referred to there, and independent audits of the reports of the Catholic Church Safeguarding Authority, which other religions now do, so that there's sort of that outside scrutiny of sort of past investigations and current support, not necessarily to criticise, but so that we can make sure that the church is moving in the same general direction and at the same sort of speed as other organisations that are doing similar things. It all looks quite insular when you look at it. It's about the church marking its own homework, whereas other organisations have now accepted that you need to bring in that sort of independent role in that, and that might help with some of the decision making we talked about earlier.
How does this compare with the recommendation you made in the Church of England report that there should be an independent safeguarding structure there, which was very controversial?
Yeah, I mean, we said similar things, as you know, about the Church of England. I mean, they do have things like people with lead responsibility, but again, the structure is very much church focused. Bishops still make the ultimate decisions. One of the things we said in the case of the Church of England is the decision making ought to be taken away from the bishops and given to those safeguarding leads. So we said very similar things. The structures of safeguarding the two different churches are quite different in that, for all its faults, there is a structure called Safeguarding the Church of England as a national remit in a way that's slightly different to the one that exists in the Catholic Church. But in both instances, I think the key for the panel is giving those people tasked with safeguarding the authority to make the decisions on when to open investigations, when and how to provide support to victims, and when to report to outside authorities. And certainly when we wrote both those reports, neither of those existed in that form in either of the two organisations.
Can I ask you, John, do you have time for 2 more questions before you have to go? I know you've got other interviews to do. Could I go to Kevin McKay next, please? Kevin's written extensively for us on the churches and sex abuse stories.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. And John, it's good to talk to you. Can I just refer you, John, to two of your recommendations. Excuse me, I've just lost your... There we are, I've got you back. Two of your recommendations. Recommendation 4 to do with external auditing, the effectiveness of the church's investigation role should be regularly validated by an independent organisation. And secondly, recommendation 7, there should be some sort of escalation process. Somebody who makes a complaint, if they're not satisfied, should be able to go to somebody outside the church with their complaint. It seems to me that both of these recommendations seem to accept that in the initial stages at least, the Roman Catholic Church will continue to have a role to play in investigating itself. Now, could it not be argued that given the scale of the abuse that you have discovered and given the church's failures in dealing with that abuse, should they have any role whatsoever? Should it not be an absolute matter of course that anybody who has a complaint, that complaint goes to an external body? In the case of a serious crime, it should go to the police and they should carry out the inquiry, because frankly, the Catholic Church has, by its own actions, disqualified itself from being able to investigate itself.
So I can fully understand why you might say that, and I know it's something that the panel always consider quite carefully. I think ultimately, though, all organisations, it's difficult if you outsource something. It sometimes means that the organisation thinks it's not anything to do with them anymore. We've outsourced it. It's X responsibility to do that, or Y's responsibility to do that. And there is a balance here in making sure that everybody within every organisation realises they have a responsibility to play in this area, with that balance of making sure that there is that external scrutiny to make sure that the organisation is doing it properly. It's a tricky one, but on balance, the panel feel if you allow somebody to divorce themselves from having any responsibility for, in this case, safeguarding, because it's outsourced to somebody else, that sometimes leads to a worsening of the recognition at a local level of what people should be doing. So I can understand why you say it, but we think that balance to be struck by making sure the church has a real role to play, and there's a real responsibility to making sure they're moving forward, which is why they've relied on that outside scrutiny. So there is a mechanism both to make sure that what they're doing is recognised as best practice, if you like, but there is that route where it fails for somebody to take the complaint outside the organisation and move it on. And the learning from that can then be checked in those internal audits, those external audits, to make sure that learning has been fed back in. But there is some evidence that the most successful organisations are those that have a major role to play in this, at least to a certain point in the investigation within their organisation, to make sure that everybody understands it's really important that safeguarding is taken seriously, if I can put it like that.
Can I bring in the other two speakers, John, before you go? Brenden, I don't know, representing Catholic Voices, whether you have a particular question for John O'Brien and what you made of the report.
Yeah, just to echo thanks, and as the Catholic Bishops' Conference in a recent statement has also echoed thanks to the work of IICSA, so just to say that right off the bat. In terms of the 3 levels, you've got the procedures, the right expertise, and the right culture. In a sense, the sense I'm getting is that the cultural aspect, or the kind of cultural conversion, seems to be the kind of most pressing. Is that kind of fair way to characterise the view of the panel?
I think it is, because it drives, their view would be, and I agree with them, is it drives the other behaviours anyway. If you've got a culture that says, in essence, this is unacceptable, then it drives all the other things you talked about there. It's much harder to change it the other way around, where you don't have that cultural change, but you have the sort of processy organisational type changes. You need that top-down cultural leadership emphasis to really make it happen.
Can I ask you, John, how close did the panel get to recommend the resignation of Cardinal Vincent Nichols?
Well, because that's not something that is within the remit of the organisation. We don't do things like that. What we look at is, what does the evidence tell us about the safeguarding role that's played, the safeguarding leadership, what's gone wrong in the past, what have been the institutional failures. So that isn't something that was or would be in consideration, not just in the Catholic Church, anywhere. Without being too pedantic about this, our terms of reference require us to look at what went wrong, to examine the evidence and say what we think would make that better. We don't arrive at things that would talk about individual punishments that individuals should face as a result of that. That's not within the terms of reference we were given.
Okay, thanks. Could I bring in Tina Beattie, perhaps if you've got any points that you want to raise with John and your first reading of the IICSA report?
Thank you. Yes, and again, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to be with you, John, and would echo much of what Brendan's just said as well about the culture changing. But like others, I was shocked by the extent to which there has been so much negligence, it seems, from senior leaders in the church. I was interested, though, about the point you make on several occasions, this culture of protecting the church before listening to the victims. And in particular, it was distressing to see what happened when confidential details were leaked in September 2018 from one victim's account. And it seems that Bishops Peter Doyle and Philip Egan really did behave in an exemplary way up to a point. But even they, it seems, yielded to pressure from Cardinal Nichols that they mustn't create difficulties for Pope Francis by making public statements about this. And so worryingly, nobody has yet traced that leak. And the other thing that interested me in your report was the sort of the appalling lack of response really from the Holy See, but also the inefficiency of the CDF. Now, as someone who has been censured by the CDF, I know that they can act within days, silence someone who speaks out on issues they don't want to be spoken about, and yet it can take them years to deal with reports of child sexual abuse and cover-ups by the hierarchy. So I just wonder if you have any more insights on that about the culture. I mean, certainly as a theologian, one of my questions would be about power and a sort of toxic culture of protecting one another that can breed in the rather anachronistic structures of the Catholic hierarchy as it is today.
Can I answer that with something I said when the panel issued the report into the Church of England a few weeks ago? Because we're talking here about the role that perhaps clergy should play versus the role that perhaps, if I can call them, safeguarding experts should say. And one of the things that we said then was that we wouldn't expect a safeguarding expert to officiate at a wedding, so we shouldn't expect bishops to really know how to handle this. And I think there's an element of truth in that. We just need to get horses for courses. There are two distinct things we're talking about here. We're talking about the spiritual nature of the church and the leadership of that side and all of that implies, and then how do some of those more operationally focused things, like how do you protect people properly, how do you deal with that? And they are two different skill sets in a way. And I think one of the things we need to do here is a recognition that bishops can't be excellent bishops and necessarily also be safeguarding experts and know how to provide the right support to people and be aware of everything that's going on in their diocese. So I think if insight's probably the wrong word, but I think if you spoke to the panel, they would say, that one of the things that isn't recognised is the need to bring in people that can do this properly and give them the authority, and that's the key thing, to make things happen. So very often we see experts being brought in, but there's a distinct lack of authority to make things happen. And I think that's the best answer I can give you to the points you just raised, really.
Well, there was a lot there to continue with. I should make it clear that we did ask the bishops to put forward someone today, but unfortunately no one was available and may not be for a week or so. But Cardinal Vincent Nichols was on Sky News this morning giving a first response to the report. And Ollie, who sits behind these Zoom calls and makes sure that technical things work. But I wonder if we could just hear what Cardinal Vincent Nichols said, please.
This doesn't make easy reading for you, does it? You are singled out personally. It says that Cardinal Nichols has shown that he cares more about the impact of child sex abuse on the Catholic Church's reputation than on victims and survivors. What's your response?
Well, no, it's very uncomfortable for me, but even more uncomfortable, I think, for many, many survivors of child sexual abuse. The damage done, which I struggle to understand, and I think I do, lasts a lifetime. And a day like today will bring to the fore all of that pain and all of that suffering again. So most of all, I want to say to anybody who has had that dreadful experience in the past, I am sorry. I am really, really mortified that this happened in the context of the Catholic Church and over this period of 50 years. And I want to promise you that we will again do every single thing in our power to get our response right. We've made progress. There's a lot more to do. But today is a day in which I wish to speak to them, first of all, and to say, I am very sorry.
I mean, the fact that you haven't really shown a great deal of empathy for those who were victims in the past was singled out in this report as well. It points out that there are a number of reports that have been carried out. You said there is still work to be done. The Nolan report in 2001, the Cumberledge report in 2007. Why have these reports not been fully implemented long ago?
Well, nobody has a silver bullet for, as it were, solving the problem of the abuse of children and the impact of that in their lives. We're not alone in struggling to get these responses right. And each of these reports has made progress. The IICSA findings acknowledge that. And since the IICSA inquiry, paying all attention to everything that was said there, we've commissioned another independent report, which will take us to the next stage, I'm quite clear. And in that, we have worked with survivors themselves. Some of them have been gracious and noble enough to work with us. They have been, in this third report that we've done, our wise counselors. And I think that is something that we've not managed to do before, and it will take us to a new phase. And I'm grateful to those who have been willing to come forward and to tell us directly of their experience and tell us what they want us to do. And that's a very important step for us.
That's quite interesting to hear his view. Brenden, I'm just going to come to you in a moment for your response, but there's a statement from Richard Scorer, who is a lawyer representing victims, who says the report is damning. There was a shocking scale of abuse, and Cardinal Nichols needs to go right away. In any other walk of life, he would be gone immediately. I wonder, Brenden, speaking from the grassroots of the Catholic Church, how this report has gone down with the people that you liaise with, and whether you think that it is time for Cardinal Vincent Nichols to step aside.
I must admit, as speaking as a lay Catholic, as Cardinal Vincent said, I feel as well ashamed, the kind of triple tragedy, not only the abuse, but the denial, the cover up. And there's this sense that an attitude previously that, this was just a kind of few outliers, a few individual cases, but slowly a recognition of the kind of systemic level that's of the problem, and therefore the changes that need to happen. The bishop's response, there's a statement, so I'll paste the kind of statement and the inquiries in the chat directly to that. But one of the things I think that comes across strongly, and this is the day, no doubt many will be aware that the McCarrick report, looking at the disgraced former Cardinal, Archbishop of Washington, the report 2 years in the making has just come out from the Vatican as well. And so kind of pressing John O'Brien about the kind of cultural change, both of, I guess, the key threads from both of those documents is a kind of unhealthy and toxic culture. And so I think the recommendations from this report will be important. And I can see why the church, the Bishops' Conference wants to kind of, they're receiving it at the same time from what I understand as everyone else. And so the response has been that it's been given to all the bishops, and the recommendation of the report is that the church move as one in this way, in a way that it seemingly hasn't before. And so responding to this, trying to take on the recommendations and then respond in one church, that's encouraging. Obviously, it remains to be seen what level of response. So I can't comment on, I don't know what the response is going to look like to the recommendations, but seemingly there's a plenary next week that's going to happen, and I'd be encouraged to see what would happen after that. Little later on in that interview, the Cardinal does also respond to questions about the moral failure of the Church and why the Holy See didn't cooperate, or his understanding of that as well. So I'm sure that will come up in later discussion, but I would echo, or at least the mindset shift I would like to see happen as a lay Catholic and other lay Catholics, is getting away from this tendency to talk about it as, the abuse crisis, as if the crisis is about our reputation. It's not. It's, you know, it's about the victims. And if everything that's going on here helps us to be more victim-centered in our mentality, to learn from the mistakes, the institutional failures, the poor leadership, the poor record keeping, all the elements that have been identified, if it helps us with and keeping that central goal in mind, then I think that, you know, regardless of the delays and all of this stuff that should be interrogated thoroughly, seeing it as a kind of step by step and slowly, I think there is an element of progress that has been seen.
Thank you. Tina, can I bring you in to that point? I saw you nodding vigorously there.
Well, I work extensively with women at the grassroots in the Catholic Church all over the world. And I think there's a deep consciousness among women that there is again, to use that word, a toxic culture of abuse of power in the Catholic hierarchy. And I worry about the fact that I don't think that lesson has been learned in the formation of new priests. And I don't see any dramatic change to this situation simply by scapegoating individual leaders, because they are part of a culture that has gone very badly wrong. And I think real grassroots reform, again, giving authority and leadership to people outside the structures of clerical power, particularly to women. I'm not saying women necessarily transform an organization immediately by being wonderful moral angels, but there is a custodianship of the young among women, and there is a contribution to be made, a wisdom to be had that is currently not being heard in the Catholic Church. So I think this report is disturbing about Cardinal Nichols' failings. I get weary of hearing yet again, I'm so sorry, we're going to do better, because quite frankly, we've heard that far too often in the last 10 years. And as the report says, it's time to stop talking and start doing. And I think that needs a fundamental change. The McCarrick report that's come out today, I agree with Brenden, it points to this being a really extensive problem in the culture of leadership in the Catholic Church. And it's compounded with dishonesty among themselves. You know, the McCarrick report, clearly this man was promoted because people advising each other were not telling the truth and still aren't. So even as they defend each other, they're not honest with each other. Honestly, it's a hornet's nest. The whole thing needs grassroots reform, and blaming a pope, blaming a cardinal, blaming one individual isn't going to change that, because the system will throw up somebody who will bring all the same problems again.
How do you even attempt to start that work, Tina?
Women in positions of leadership, lay leaders, you know, again, that expertise that comes with saying this is what you're entrusted to do and you can't do everything, a dismantling of the power structures that allow such abuse. And anyone working in any public lay role in the Catholic Church will have first-hand experience of how that abuse works. And to me, we've got to have joined up thinking in analysing the problem, because the sex abuse, and I agree, let's stop calling it a crisis, what's happening to vulnerable people and children. And we haven't even got onto the subject of African nuns yet. That's another whole situation waiting to erupt. What's happening is a symptom of something deeply, deeply wrong in the institutions and structures and relationships of the Catholic leadership. And so as we tackle and must tackle this scandal and hear the victims, we must also say, if the goal is listening to victims, there are going to be continuing victims. The goal has to be to root out the problem at its source.
I share quite a lot of what Tina says, but I'm afraid the idea that we're going to solve this by bringing in women, custodians of the young, the evidence shows that's not necessarily the case. There are quite a lot of people who are involved in safeguarding in the Catholic Church, brought in recent years, who was shown in the evidence given to IICSA that their view of survivors, victims of abuse, were just as problematic as any bishop. There's some social workers, for example, had some extraordinary things to say about victims during the hearings. So I don't think that's going to be the magic bullet, just bringing in some lay people. They've tried that and it didn't solve the problem.
If I can come back on that, I agree that bringing in individual women to individual roles doesn't change. But a wholesale reform would require looking at the ways in which gender operates in Catholic leadership, but also, as John O'Brien made clear, ultimately even the most senior woman or even the most senior layperson is beholden to the bishops. And I'm sure we all know of people who eventually, whether in the Vatican's Commission on Child Protection or here in local safeguarding organisations, have just given up in despair because the impotence actually to take effective action is so often felt by those who go in thinking they can make a change. But I'm not saying women just transform things per se, but they are the greatest symptom of a change happening if women were to be given more authority and not in positions where a bishop can just decide to ignore them or override them, which is always what happens today.
Andrew, we haven't actually gone into any detail about what the McCarrick report says, but I know that you have read it as much as you can this morning. Can you just summarise for the rest of us the kind of lessons that you think, or any parallels that you find between the two, IICSA and the McCarrick report that came out just 1 hour later?
Well, both cases are to some extent a failure of hierarchy. They are tangled up in that it's quite clear from the IICSA report that in one of the cases where Cardinal Nichols was criticised for placing the reputation of the church ahead of that of the problems of survivors, what he was actually worried about was not the reputation of the church in the eyes of English secularists, but what use would be made of it in 2018, what use would be made of this story in 2018 by Pope Francis's opponents within the Catholic Church in America, the whole Vigano network, who were, of course, set off by the claims of Archbishop Vigano, the former Vatican nuncio in Washington, that Pope Francis had connived in the crimes of Cardinal McCarrick. One of the things this report makes clear, and really rather an important one, is that this is absolute nonsense, that Vigano himself was asked to investigate the allegations and did nothing whatever. But before that, there is an extremely long story in which the villain, if there is one, is actually Saint John Paul II, because in the 1990s, when McCarrick was first made a bishop in New Jersey, there were a lot of rumors and stories about him. On the other hand, he was charismatic, he was very, very good at raising money, and he had made a good personal impression on John Paul II. Now, these stories to his disadvantage, basically that everybody knew that seminarians were expected to share his bed in his bathhouse and so on and so forth, for certain values of everybody, were strong enough and widely circulated that in 1999, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, John O'Connor, wrote to the Pope saying, there are these stories, because of them, McCarrick has been passed over for 3 different promotions. Are you really sure you want to send him to Washington? McCarrick then writes to the Pope's private secretary, Stanislav Živić, a figure regarded by many people as rather sinister, saying he was a virgin, he had never had sex with man, woman, child in his entire life. These were all calumnies. And John Paul II promoted him to Washington. And there were, and four of his fellow bishops in New Jersey had been asked about him, and 3 of them, basically, the report is not exactly clear how, lied, saying he was okay when it was well known that he wasn't, or claiming that they'd never heard anything to his disadvantage. You know, this is a very deep institutional corruption, which was later weaponized, as the report doesn't make clear, but the mere fact that it was summoned into being makes clear. It was weaponized by the enemies of Pope Francis. And I think really what you can't read the McCarrick report without thinking that the English Church got off quite lightly.
Well, it's three popes to one cardinal in certain terms. But can I come back to you, Brenden? Just having heard all that, what else has to happen within the Roman Catholic Church to utterly shake the confidence of people who turn up, give their money, give their time, believe the tenets of faith? We heard earlier someone saying it wasn't a crisis. Is this a crisis for the man and woman in the pew?
Yeah, it deeply affects the faith of every Catholic. And in a sense, there would be a negligence if it didn't. The kind of perspective I came to faith being involved with youth ministry within the church when I was 18. I was blessed to have a very positive experience of that, and then working with young people for a number of years within a church context. And as I read this report, a lot of it, of course, I don't deny it, and the victims are the survivors are first and foremost in my mind. But in a sense, like, I don't recognize it in my own experience. Safeguarding has been there, kind of at the forefront of lots of the conversations that we have. So I recognize at least a change. And of course, like all of the things that said, there's a problem with implementation and a need for hearts and minds to change and all of the kind of cultural leadership. But I think that it's fair to say, and the report does say, I'm quoting from the end here, that there has undoubtedly been improvements in the church's response, but there's more to do, basically. So in terms of what can be done to kind of increase people's confidence, I think, yes, there has been a lot of kind of talks and apologies. Some of the tone has improved. There's certainly a shift in the tone away from a kind of defensiveness. But that has to, with some of the pragmatic, to be better at communicating what is the clear pragmatic. I think some of the recommendations are quite clear, like, making the CSAS website a bit more accessible and making information a bit easier to manage. I'm inspired by the call, at least, of Pope Francis to say that kind of integrity has to precede policy. If we're not challenged by the testimony of victims and allow our hearts to be broken, we're not going to have the hearts and minds, we're not going to have the conviction to follow through. I think there was a previous narrative when the Cumberledge Commission review came up and the Nolan report that, we've got this sorted, we're a model institution, we've reformed, past tense. And I think that's not true to say. We have to say we're reforming. So there can't be that kind of closed, and a little bit like what John O'Brien was saying, this sense of, well, if we can just kind of kick the ball out to other institutions, and this is all a bit scary, so we don't we want to deal with it, or to leave it only to to leave it only to experts in a sense and have none of that cooperation. So I think that as the church, and we'll see from how the bishops respond to the recommendations and the statements that come out, that will have a kind of key influence in not only the kind of public statements, but also the kind of practice that follows.
Well, we have been, we are in negotiations to get a bishop when they are ready to say something, and perhaps you'll come back, Brenden, at that point and make your points there as well. Can I bring in Andrew Greystone at this point?
Thanks, Ruth. My engagement with this is almost exclusively from the point of view of victims. And the thing that I don't feel is being addressed by the church is pain, is the absolute agony of what it is to be a victim of abuse, particularly in the church. Why is it that the hierarchy of the church finds it so difficult to own the pain of victims? I understand that there are apologies and apologies come very easily, but there is a sense of not actually understanding the humanity. I wonder why.
Brenden, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, I think there's when Pope Benedict came and visited the UK in 2010, one of the things he did, as had become the norm really for papal visits, was to meet with victims discreetly, not as a kind of PR game, but as a sense of being challenged by the testimony of victims. I know from hearing from bishops personally, bishops who clear out, every month, sometimes weekly at some points, time to listen to the testimony of victims. And compared to the kind of statements that were quoted from the Cardinal, say, a couple of years ago in various documentaries, versus this report today and some of the statements being made by bishops, there is more of an acknowledgement of pain. Now, I think the pain is also, compounded in a way if there isn't, it's a well and good kind of listening and having that, but how does that translate into action? But from the perspective of pain, I've seen there are different ministries going up through the church. So one of the areas that's highlighted as a success story is the Survivor Advisory Panel. And as the Cardinal mentioned in his comments, having them as kind of key collaborators. So perhaps it was the voice of pain that was missing from some of these, to either take a kind of technocratic approach. So, if we get the policies and procedures in place, then we'll have everything sorted, isn't complemented by the kind of the shifts of mentality that need to happen, which I guess are precipitated and by the testimony of victims.
Thank you. And I know we have 3 communications officers from the Catholic Church on the call. If you have a statement or anything that or a contribution you'd like to make, you're very welcome to speak. Can I ask for you, Tina, to just reflect on that question from Andrew, perhaps, the question of pain?
I think it's a question that we need to really be much better in the church at the psychological aspects of priestly formation and mature sexual development. Because the truth is, it takes an enormously mature and brave person to face up to the unbearable pain of another, particularly when one is in some way complicit in the source of that pain. And it's why I think the whole system needs to be rethought. How are priests selected? How are they formed? How are they taught to bear the pain of bearing another's pain and to be vulnerable and to learn those lessons? We are so far from that. Of course, there are individual priests and bishops who do this wonderfully. And it's, again, I come back to Philip Egan and Peter Doyle were mentioned in the report as bishops who at least seem to have set some kind of example up to a point. But to listen to the pain of another, the church needs to draw on the immense psychological wisdom that we have in modern culture, on the understanding of how humans deal with pain and guilt in a much better way to inform its theology. And we're not nearly there yet. But also your question, what about ordinary people in the pews? Part of the challenge the bishops are going to face is most of us aren't in the pews at the moment. And are we going to go back? I know so many who are asking themselves, and it's not a question of, am I going to leave the Catholic faith? But am I going to find other ways of expressing my faith than showing up and paying up and keeping quiet? One way or the other, though, every single one of us has to exercise vigilance and has to find the courage to speak out. But that can be very difficult, because I know we all hear the rumour mill. We all know stories that are not being heard. And it's very, very challenging. If you only hear one story about one priest, you don't want to destroy that priest by saying, this is what I've heard. There need to be channels where we can confidentially share some of these concerns and have justice brought for those who might be wrongly accused and the victims who are trying to be heard, because there are still many stories that are not out there in the open. And I suspect most of us with our ear to the ground know a few of those.
Thank you, Tina. Kevin, do you have a final question, suggestion that you might?
If I may, I just wanted to hear Tina maybe just address a question that was raised by Catherine earlier talking to John, and that is this sort of fundamental kind of philosophical difference almost between the way the church operates and maybe the way the rest of society operates, so that when the church hears about wrongdoing, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction to try to save the sinner. And, the concept of redemption, forgiveness comes in. The rest of society maybe would be more intent to punish the sinner and to focus on the victim. And I'd just like to hear Tina maybe talk a bit about that. Again, is this something that possibly imposes some sort of barrier towards the whole concept of the church policing itself?
Yeah, they're complex questions. I could write a theology book on that. I suppose, though, it goes back to what I was saying about psychology and the psychology of sin and blame and guilt and shame, that we need to have a much wiser understanding of what sin is and what repentance is, and who can forgive and what can be forgiven. And forgiving isn't forgetting. Of course, they're not always so hesitant to blame people. I mean, women well know that there is lots of unconditional blame attaches to some things regarded as sins, mainly to do with reproductive and sexual issues. So there is a kind of use, I think, of forgiveness and that doctrine of redemption in some cases that's not quite so freely applied in others. Again, it's a vastly complex question. I would hate to see a church that lost that wisdom of forgiveness, and there's always healing, there's always redemption, but that redemption is conditional upon genuine deep transformation, and that's what we're not seeing. And indeed, there's a vexed question about how possible it is for, we know that particularly paedophiles, how much transformation is possible. And you can't just ship them around from parish to parish, because this seems to be a fundamental problem that is very, very, very difficult to heal in a person. But the abusers are often abused, and that's another huge question we need to ask.
Thank you, Tina. Just to say that this, I think, is part one of a series. So we hope to be back, as I say, in about a fortnight's time with a bishop. And I hope that Tina and Brenden, you'll join us again on that occasion, at least. Everyone is welcome. Eileen, Laura and Georgia, you'd be welcome to join our Zoom calls in the future going forward. Add your names to our list. So I would like to thank everyone for taking the time out today to take part in a very difficult day. I think not just in England and Wales, but with the McCarrick report as well. It's a bit overwhelming, really. But thank you very much for your response and for taking the time, and I hope to see you again. Take care. Bye.